He married a widow for a horse. It was a simple deal, a desperate bargain whispered in the dusty air of a Colorado livery stable. Mark Yoder, a poor Amish man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mule too thin to ride, would get the strong roan gelding he needed to survive. In return, the widow, Chloe Concade, a woman whose size was the cruel joke of the entire town, would get a husband, a name on a piece of paper, a shield. The church bell tolled over the dusty street, sealing the pact. The preacher's words were sparse, the vows exchanged like currency. There was no love, no tenderness, only the stark reality of two people backed into a corner. That night, as the mountain moon rose cold and white over the valley, they rode to her ranch, his new home. He followed the solid shape of her on horseback, a stranger he was now bound to before God. He tended to the horses, his hands gentle and sure, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and prayer. Finally, he walked to the main house, to the room she'd pointed out as hers. He was her husband. This was their wedding night. He reached for the door and found it locked. A sharp metallic click echoed in the silent house. A barrier of wood and iron between them. He stood there in the dark hallway, the smell of wood smoke and loneliness thick in the air. He had traded his freedom for a horse, only to find himself a prisoner of a different kind. He knocked softly, his knuckles barely grazing the rough-hewn wood. The silence that answered was louder than any shout. This wasn't just a locked door. It was a statement, a warning. And as he stood there, shivering in the sudden cold, he realized the horse wasn't the only thing at stake. He had just walked into a war he didn't understand, and his new wife had placed him on the front lines, alone. That wasn't the biggest secret she was keeping, not by a long shot. Mark didn't knock again. His ma had taught him that a man's dignity was his own to keep. He turned without a word, his worn leather bag in hand, and stepped back out onto the porch. The night air was sharp, biting with the chill of the high country. He laid his plain coat on the wooden planks for a pillow, the rough fabric a poor substitute for a bed. He wasn't a stranger to hardship, but the cold that seeped into his bones felt different this time. It felt like betrayal. He lay there staring up at the spray of stars across the black velvet sky. A coyote yipped in the distant hills, a lonely sound that echoed the hollowness in his chest. He closed his eyes and whispered the words of a psalm his father had taught him, the familiar German cadence a small comfort in this strange, unwelcoming place. Der Herr ist mein Hirte, he murmured into the darkness. The Lord is my shepherd. The words were a prayer for guidance, a plea for understanding. What kind of woman would strike such a bargain only to turn him away? What was she so afraid of? Dawn broke rose and gold over the mountains, finding Mark already awake. He washed his face at the ice-cold pump, the shock of the water a welcome distraction. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't wait for his new wife to emerge from her locked room. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. The corral fence sagged like a tired old man, its rails weathered and broken. In the barn he found a hammer, a handful of rusty nails, and some spare lumber. He set to work, the rhythmic thud of the hammer the only sound in the early morning quiet. Each strike was a blow against his confusion, each repaired rail a small piece of order in the chaos of his new life. He was a farmer, a carpenter. This he understood. Mending what was broken was in his blood. The sun was climbing higher when he heard the back door of the house creak open. He didn't look up, but he felt her eyes on him. He kept working, his movements steady and efficient, letting his labor speak for him. A group of riders appeared on the road, slowing their horses as they passed the ranch. Their voices carried on the clear morning air. "Well, looky there," one of them drawled, a cruel smirk in his tone. "The widow Concade's got herself a mule to go with her new horse." Another man laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Heard she paid for him with old man Concade's prize gelding. A desperate trade, if you ask me." Mark's hands tightened on the wooden rail, but he didn't stop. He focused on the hammer, on the nail, on the solid feel of wood beneath his hands. He had heard worse. But as he drove the nail home, he chanced to look toward the house. Chloe stood in the kitchen window, a silhouette against the light, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the edge of the sink. It wasn't anger he saw on her face. It was fear. pure, unadulterated fear. And in that instant, a chilling thought struck him. She hadn't married him to keep the world at bay. She had married him to put him between her and the world. He wasn't her shield. He was her target. The riders moved on, their laughter fading down the dusty road. But a new tension hung in the air. Chloe disappeared from the window, and for a long time, the only sound was Mark's hammer. He finished the section of fence, stepping back to admire his work. The rails were straight now, the posts solid. It was a good repair, honest work, but it did little to settle the unease coiling in his gut. The kitchen door opened, and Chloe emerged. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee, the steam rising from them in the cool air. She walked toward him with a determined stride, her face set in its usual stern lines, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "Didn't ask you to fix that," she said, her voice gruff as she handed him a cup. "No," Mark agreed, his fingers brushing hers as he took the warm cup. But it needed doing. They stood in an awkward silence, the space between them filled with unspoken questions. The morning sun warmed his back, but it didn't touch the chill he felt when he looked at her. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes again, the same fear he'd seen when the riders passed. She was a woman living on a knife's edge, and he was beginning to suspect she'd pulled him onto it with her. "There's breakfast inside," she said finally, turning back toward the house. "Can't have you working on an empty stomach." He followed her into the kitchen. It was clean and tidy but worn. The furnishings were sparse, the floors scrubbed bare. It was the home of someone who had been alone for a long time, someone who had learned to make do. She served him salt pork and cornbread, her movements efficient, almost mechanical. They ate in silence, the clink of their forks on the tin plates, the only conversation. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, watching her from under the brim of his hat. He had agreed to this marriage out of desperation, but he had made a vow before God. He was her husband, and whatever danger she was in, it was his danger now too. For a week this became their routine. He slept on the porch, rose before dawn, and worked until dusk. He mended the barn roof, cleared the overgrown garden, and sharpened every tool he could find. He brought order back to the neglected ranch, piece by piece. She watched him from the house, her silence a wall between them. But he noticed small changes. The meals grew larger. A fresh bar of soap and a clean towel appeared by the pump each morning. She never said a word of thanks, but her actions spoke for her. One afternoon, as he was splitting firewood, the rhythmic crack of the axe a steady beat in the quiet air, he noticed her watching him from the porch. For the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. It looked like respect. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, she finally broke the silence. "You're a good worker," she said, her eyes fixed on her plate. "Better than I expected." "I do what needs doing," he replied simply. "The townsfolk talk," she said, changing the subject abruptly. "They say I was a fool to marry you, that you're just after my land." "Is that what you believe?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She finally looked up, her green eyes searching his. "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. And in that moment, he saw past the stern exterior, past the fear. He saw a woman who was profoundly, desperately lonely. A woman who had been hurt so badly she didn't know how to trust anyone. "I am your husband, Chloe," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I gave my word before God. I will not harm you." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away angrily as if furious at her own weakness. "Words are cheap," she muttered. "Then I will show you with my actions," he promised. The next day they hitched up the wagon for the trip into town. They needed supplies and Chloe had eggs to trade. As they walked into the mercantile, the bell above the door jangling, a hush fell over the store. The usual crowd of loafers by the pickle barrel turned to stare, their faces a mixture of scorn and amusement. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," one of them sneered. "Come to spend the profits from that horse trade?" Chloe flinched as if struck, her shoulders hunching. Mark felt a surge of cold anger. He stepped forward, placing himself between Chloe and the men. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You will speak to my wife with respect," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "Or you will not speak to her at all." The men shuffled their feet, their smirks faltering under his steady, unwavering gaze. The store owner hurried forward, eager to break the tension. For the first time since he'd arrived, Mark saw something other than fear or suspicion in Chloe's eyes. It was a flicker of surprise, a spark of gratitude. As they rode home in the wagon, the silence felt different, less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be filled. That night she didn't lock her door. She left it slightly ajar. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Mark still slept on the porch, but as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this broken bargain could be mended after all. But as he closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that the men in the store were the least of their worries. The real threat was still out there, circling like a wolf in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was coming for them. The peace, fragile as it was, didn't last. A few days later, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck against the brilliant blue sky. This was no common ranch hand. The man rode a sleek bay horse, and his suit was a fine dark wool, out of place in the dusty landscape. He carried himself with an air of arrogant confidence, the kind that came from having money and power and knowing how to use both. He reined in his horse in the yard, dust swirling around his polished boots. Mark set down the axe he'd been using and moved to stand by the porch, his body a quiet shield in front of the house. Chloe came out, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale. "Mrs. Kincaid," the man said, his smile as slick as oil on water. He tipped his expensive hat. "Though I suppose it's Mrs. Yoder now. My name is Redmond, from the Western Pacific Railroad." His eyes flicked dismissively over Mark's plain Amish clothes before settling back on Chloe. "I'm here on a matter of business." "State your business, then," Chloe said, her voice tight. Redmond reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "It seems your late husband, Mr. Thomas Kincaid, was not as financially sound as you may have believed. He left behind several significant debts." "That's a lie," Chloe snapped. "Thomas paid his bills. This land is ours, free and clear." "The paperwork suggests otherwise," Redmond said, his smile never wavering. He held out the papers. "And the railroad has been enterprising. We've acquired these debts." His eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. "Which gives us a legal claim to this property, including the spring that runs through it." The color drained from Chloe's face. The spring. It was the lifeblood of the ranch, the only reliable water source for miles. Without it, the land was worthless. Mark stepped forward. "We will need to have our lawyer review these documents," he said, his voice calm and even. Redmond laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of any real humor. "A lawyer? And what will you pay him with? Another horse? Don't be a fool. This is railroad business. We are the law in this valley." He swung himself back onto his horse with practiced ease. "You have 2 weeks to vacate the premises. The railroad always gets what it wants." They watched him ride away, the dust settling in his wake. Chloe's hands trembled as she took the papers from Mark. Her face was a mask of disbelief and horror. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thomas wouldn't. He couldn't have." That night, for the first time, Mark crossed the threshold of her bedroom, not as a husband, but as an ally. By the flickering light of a single oil lamp, she pulled a battered wooden trunk from beneath her bed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the ranch's papers, the deed, the tax receipts, the letters from her late husband. For hours they sat on the floor, the papers spread around them like fallen leaves, searching for an answer, for some weapon to fight back with. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and desperation. Mark's methodical calm was a steady anchor in the storm of Chloe's panic. He examined each document, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, as the lamp began to gutter, his hand fell on a yellowed, brittle document, the original land grant, signed and sealed by a territorial governor decades ago. He smoothed it out carefully. "Chloe, look at this." He pointed to a clause at the bottom of the page. The ink faded but still legible. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. The water rights to the spring were inalienable, tied to the land itself with one specific ironclad condition: The rights were preserved for Thomas Concade and his wife, and in the event of his death, they would pass to his widow, so long as she remained legally wed and maintained residence upon the property. Chloe stared at the words, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. She sank back against the bed, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping her lips. So that's it, she breathed. That's why he did it. Thomas, Mark said, his voice filled with a newfound respect for the man he'd never met. He was protecting you. He knew this could happen. Suddenly, their strange, desperate bargain was cast in a new light. It wasn't just a business deal. It wasn't just a shield. It was the key. The one thing standing between their home and the all-consuming greed of the railroad. Their sham marriage, the joke of the entire town, had just become their only hope for survival. But as the reality of their situation settled in, a new, more terrifying question emerged. They had the deed. They had the clause. But Redmond had the forged debt notes, and he had something else, too. He had the town in his pocket. How could two outcasts, a fat widow and her Amish husband, stand against the power of the railroad when everyone already believed their marriage was a lie? They weren't just fighting for their land anymore. They were fighting for the very truth of the vows they had taken. The next morning they rode into town, the precious land grant tucked safely in a leather folder. The air was tense, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Every glance from a passer-by felt like an accusation. Every whispered comment, a judgment. The courthouse was a simple clapboard building, but today it felt as imposing as a fortress. Inside, the county clerk, a balding man named Peterson, peered at them over his glasses. "Mrs. Yoder," he said, the name sounding foreign on his tongue, "what can I do for you?" "We're here to file a copy of our land grant and reaffirm our water rights," Chloe said, her voice steadier than she felt. Peterson took the document, his eyebrows raising as he read the clause. "Well, this is unusual, but it seems to be in order." He had just begun to make a copy when the courthouse door swung open with a bang. Redmond strode in, his face a thundercloud. He must have had a spy watching the ranch. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are trespassing on property that legally belongs to the Western Pacific Railroad." "This document says otherwise," Mark said, his quiet voice cutting through Redmond's bluster. Redmond snatched the paper from the clerk's desk. He scanned it, his lip curling into a sneer. "This is meaningless, a desperate trick. Your marriage is a fraud, a sham you concocted to try and cheat us." He threw the paper back on the desk. "And I can prove it." He snapped his fingers, and a man stepped forward from the back of the room. It was Mr. Miller, the owner of the livery stable, the very place where their bargain had been struck. Miller's eyes darted around nervously, avoiding Chloe's gaze. "Tell the clerk what you told me, Miller," Redmond commanded. Miller cleared his throat. I heard them," he stammered, "the day they got married. She said she needed a man who could work. He said he needed a horse. It was a trade, a business deal, that's all." Chloe's heart sank. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Redmond's smile was triumphant. "You see," he said to the clerk, "a marriage of convenience. It won't hold up in any court. This clause is null and void." It felt like a checkmate. Their own words, their own desperation, had become the weapon used against them. The clerk looked from the paper to their faces, his expression troubled. The law was the law, but the story was damning. They were trapped. Just as Peterson was about to speak, the courthouse doors opened again. This time, there was no bang, no bluster. 3 figures entered in silence, their presence instantly commanding the attention of everyone in the room. It was Greyhawk, the Ute elder, his face a mask of dignified composure. With him were his wife and his son. They walked to the center of the room, their buckskin clothing a stark contrast to Redmond's fine suit. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. "We have come to speak the truth," Greyhawk said, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of generations. He looked not at Redmond, but at the clerk. "The man Thomas Concade was an honest man. He was my friend." He paused, letting his words settle. A week before the sickness took him, he came to me. He was troubled. He said the iron horse was coming and that its masters had hungry eyes. Greyhawk's dark eyes now fixed on Redmond, pinning him in place. He told me he had protected his wife, his Chloe. He told me of a paper, a promise that as long as she was wed and lived on the land, the water, the life of the land, would be hers. Redmond scoffed. The ramblings of an old Indian. It means nothing. But the clerk was listening, his expression rapt. Greyhawk's son stepped forward. I too have seen, he said, his young voice clear and steady. I have seen this new man, this Mark Yoder. I have seen him mend the fences. I have seen him treat his horse with kindness. I have seen him look at his wife not as a bargain, but as a partner. The testimony was powerful, a testament to character that no legal document could capture. It chipped away at Redmond's narrative, planting seeds of doubt in the room. But it was still their word against his. They had honor, but he had the forged papers and a witness. The scale was still tipped against them, and Redmond knew it. He saw his advantage and pressed it, moving in for the kill. He turned to the sheriff, who had been standing quietly in the corner. Sheriff, I am formally charging this man, Mark Yoder, with trespassing and attempting to defraud the Western Pacific Railroad. I have signed affidavits from 2 men who saw him moving survey stakes on railroad property just last night. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Mark hadn't left the ranch, but it was a sworn statement. The sheriff sighed, his face weary. He was a man caught in the middle. I'm sorry, Mark, the sheriff said, his voice low. I have to take you in. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metal glinting in the dusty light. As he clamped them on Mark's wrists, he leaned in close, his voice a barely audible whisper meant only for Mark. I have no choice. Redmond, he promised the company doctor for my wife. She's very sick. The final piece clicked into place. It wasn't just greed, it was coercion, blackmail. The law itself was a hostage. Mark looked at Chloe, his eyes full of a sorrow so deep it stole her breath. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being swallowed whole by a corrupt system, and the one man who was supposed to uphold the law was the one tightening the chains. Chloe was alone again, facing a monster with tentacles wrapped around the entire town. The clang of the jail cell door echoed in the sudden silence of the courthouse. It was a sound of finality, of defeat. Chloe watched, her body numb, as they led Mark away. His back was straight, his head held high, but she could see the weight of the injustice bowing his shoulders. Redmond stood by, a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. He had won. He had her husband in chains and her ranch in his sights. Chloe stood frozen, the eyes of the town upon her. She could feel their pity, their scorn, their morbid curiosity. The fat widow who had bought a husband only to have him thrown in jail. The whispers started again, a venomous tide rising around her. She turned and fled, pushing through the swinging doors of the courthouse, gulping in the hot, dusty air as if she'd been drowning. She rode home in a daze, the familiar landscape a blur of sun-scorched earth and mocking blue sky. The ranch, when she arrived, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison of silence and memory. Every mended fence, every cleared field, was a testament to the man they had taken from her. The house was a hollow shell, echoing with the absence of his quiet presence. That night she didn't eat. She couldn't. She walked through the empty rooms, her hand tracing the smooth wood of a chair he had fixed, the solid frame of a window he had repaired. His Bible lay on the small table by the hearth, a silent testament to his unwavering faith, a faith she had never shared, a faith she desperately needed now. Darkness fell, and the house grew cold. The loneliness was a physical presence, a crushing weight that forced her to her knees. She knelt on the rough wooden floor of her bedroom, the room they had never shared, and for the first time since Thomas had died, she prayed. Not the polite, rote prayers of her childhood, but a raw, desperate cry from the depths of her soul. Lord, she whispered, the word a rusty key in a long-locked door. I don't know if you're listening. I haven't given you much reason to. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime and dust of the day. But he is a good man. a better man than I deserve. He came here with nothing, and he gave me everything. He gave me back my hope. He gave me back my home." Her voice broke in a sob. "They've taken him. They've twisted the truth, and they've bought the law. I'm alone, and I'm afraid. Please, please don't let them break him. And please, give me the strength to fight for him." She stayed there for hours, her knees aching, her voice hoarse, pouring out years of pain, of loneliness, of fear. She confessed her bitterness, her pride, the walls she had built around her heart. And as she prayed, something shifted within her. A small, hard knot of despair began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, terrifying flicker of resolve. She was still kneeling when she heard a soft, hesitant knock on the front door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who would be calling at this hour? One of Redmond's men, come to terrorize her? She rose slowly, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. It's me, Mrs. Yoder, Preacher Davidson." The preacher? What could he possibly want? She cautiously opened the door a crack. He stood on her porch, a hunched, pathetic figure in the moonlight. His face was ashen, his eyes haunted. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I have a confession to make." She let him in, her mind racing. He stood twisting his hat in his hands in the middle of her kitchen, refusing to sit. The air was thick with his guilt. "The railroad," he began, his voice cracking. "Redmond. He didn't just bribe me to rush his paperwork through. It was more than that." The preacher took a deep, shuddering breath. "My daughter. She has a weakness in her lungs. Redmond found out. He threatened to expose a small debt I owed, a debt that would have cost me the church. He said he would ruin me, leave my family with nothing. He said my daughter wouldn't survive a winter on the streets." Chloe listened, her anger warring with a sudden, sharp pity. "What did he make you do?" she asked, her voice cold. The preacher looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. "The debt notes from your husband. The ones Redmond holds. Thomas Concade never signed them." He choked on the words. "I did. Redmond stood over me while I practiced his signature again and again. He forced me to forge them." The confession hung in the air, a monstrous, ugly thing. It was the missing piece, the proof they needed. But it was a confession born of fear, from a man broken by threats. "Will you testify?" Chloe asked, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Will you tell this to the judge?" The preacher's face crumpled. "He'll destroy me," he whimpered. "He'll destroy my family." "He is destroying mine," Chloe shot back, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "He has put an innocent man in chains. He is trying to steal this land, this home that we have built. What is your soul worth, preacher? What is justice worth?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mouth agape. He saw not the fat widow, the town joke, but a woman transformed, a warrior fighting for her husband, for her home. He saw the strength that he himself lacked. Slowly, painfully, he straightened his shoulders. A flicker of his old fire, the fire of the pulpit, returned to his eyes. "You are right," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its former resonance. "God forgive me, you are right." He met her gaze, his own filled with a terrible, dawning courage. "I will testify. I will tell the court everything." The day of the hearing arrived, gray and overcast, the sky threatening a storm that matched the turmoil in Chloe's heart. The courthouse was packed, a suffocating sea of curious and judgmental faces. Chloe sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, but she kept her gaze fixed forward. Mark was brought in, his wrists still in chains. He looked tired, but his eyes found hers across the crowded room, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod. That simple gesture was enough to steady her nerves. Redmond began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He presented the forged debt notes. He called his paid witnesses, who dutifully lied about seeing Mark tampering with survey stakes. He painted a picture of Mark as a drifter and a con man, and Chloe as a foolish, desperate woman. It was a masterful performance, and Chloe could feel the mood of the courtroom swaying in his favor. Then Chloe's lawyer called their first witness, Greyhawk. The Ute elder walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. He spoke of his friendship with Thomas Concade. He spoke of Mark's character, of his respect for the land. He spoke the simple, unvarnished truth, and his words were like a clean wind blowing through the stale, lie-filled air. Next came the preacher. When his name was called, a gasp went through the crowd. Preacher Davidson walked to the stand, his face pale but resolute. He looked directly at the judge, his hands trembling as he took the oath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking but clear, "I have come to confess my sin." He told them everything, the threats against his family, the coercion, the forgery. He described the very pen Redmond had given him, the specific brand of ink, details only the forger could know. He then produced a piece of paper, and in front of the entire court, wrote Thomas Concade's name. The signature was a perfect match for the one on the debt notes. The courtroom erupted. Redmond leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting objections, calling the preacher a liar. But it was too late. The truth, once unleashed, could not be put back in its cage. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order. His face was grim. He looked from the preacher's confession to the forged documents, and then to Redmond. "Mr. Redmond," the judge said, his voice cold as iron, "you will have a chance to answer to these very serious allegations. But first, I believe Mrs. Yoder has something she wishes to say." All eyes turned to Chloe. She rose, her legs trembling, but her voice when she spoke was strong and clear. "My marriage did not begin with love," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the people who had mocked her for so long. "It began with need, my need for protection, and my husband's need for a new start. You all saw it as a bargain, a joke, and for a time, so did I." She turned her eyes to Mark, a world of unspoken emotion passing between them. "But you were all wrong, and I was wrong, because what started as a bargain has become a covenant. This man who you call a drifter has shown me more kindness and honor than I have ever known. He mended my fences, but he also mended my heart. He defended my name when I was too beaten down to defend it myself. He showed me what it means to have faith, not just in God, but in the goodness of another person." She turned back to the judge, her voice ringing with passion. "This isn't about water rights and property lines anymore. It's about a home that was built not just with wood and stone, but with hard work and respect and love." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, hung in the air, beautiful and undeniable. The railroad can produce all the forged papers it wants, but it cannot forge that. It cannot fake the truth of what we have built together. This is our home, and we will not let it be stolen by lies. She sat down, her heart pounding. The courtroom was utterly silent. The judge looked at her, then at Mark, then at the mountain of evidence, true and false, before him. He picked up his gavel. The sound it made when it struck the wood was like a crack of thunder, a final, definitive judgment. "This court finds in favor of Mark and Chloe Yoder," he declared. "The property and all water rights remain theirs. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate release of Mr. Yoder and launching a full investigation into the business practices of the Western Pacific Railroad, starting with Mr. Redmond." A roar went up from the back of the courtroom. Chloe burst into tears, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming gratitude. Through the blur, she saw the sheriff unlocking Mark's chains. He was free. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. He pushed through the crowd, through the well-wishers, until he was standing in front of her. He took her hands in his, and in front of the entire town, he pulled her to her feet and into his arms. "You did it, Chloe," he whispered into her hair. "You saved us." "No," she whispered back, her face buried in his chest. "We saved each other." They rode home as the storm finally broke, a cleansing rain washing the dust from the air and turning the parched earth dark and fertile. They didn't speak, but their hands kept finding each other, a light touch on the arm, fingers brushing as they adjusted the reins. The silence was full, not empty, brimming with everything that had been won. The ranch looked different in the rain-washed light, more vibrant, more alive. It looked like a promise. Their home. Inside, a fire in the hearth chased away the chill. They moved around the small kitchen in a quiet, comfortable dance, making supper. It was a simple meal, but it felt like a feast. After they ate, Mark took her hand and led her from the kitchen. He didn't lead her to the porch. He didn't lead her to a separate room. He led her to her bedroom, the room that had been a symbol of their division for so long. He pushed the door open wide. The room was lit by a single lamp, its golden light soft and inviting. He turned to her, his face serious in the flickering light. "Chloe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I made a vow to you before God, to love and to honor. I meant those words then, out of duty. I mean them now with all of my heart." "Mark," she whispered, her own tears starting to fall again. "I locked this door against you. I was so afraid, afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting. And now," he asked, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "Now," she said, leaning into his touch, "I'm only afraid of how much I love you." He bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of profound tenderness, a sealing of the covenant she had spoken of in the courthouse. It was a promise of a new beginning, a final, quiet turning of a lock that had kept them apart for too long. That night, for the first time, the door wasn't just unlocked. It was open, and in the warm, safe circle of each other's arms, two lonely, broken people finally, truly came home. But their story wasn't over. They had won their battle, but they soon discovered that their victory had planted a seed of hope that would grow into something far bigger than just one ranch, one family. Because out in the darkness of the valley, other families were fighting their own desperate battles against the railroad, and they were losing. What Mark and Chloe didn't know yet was that their fight for their home was about to become a fight for the soul of the entire valley. And hidden away, in the possession of two ragged orphans, was a secret that could change everything. Spring arrived in the mountains like a long-held breath finally released. The snow melted, the creeks ran full and clear, and the valley floor was carpeted in a riot of wildflowers. The ranch, once a place of neglect and sorrow, was now teeming with life. Mark, with his farmer's intuition, had planted a sprawling garden that was already showing rows of tender green shoots. The fences were strong, the barn roof was sound, and the sound of laughter often echoed in the yard. Their victory in court had made them unlikely heroes. Families who had once been cowed by the railroad began to look at the Yoder Ranch as a symbol of defiance. But it was a hollow victory in some ways. The federal investigation into the railroad was moving at a snail's pace, and Redmond, though disgraced, was replaced by a man just as ruthless. Other ranchers were still being squeezed, still losing their land to the railroad's relentless march. One day on a trip into town for supplies, Chloe saw them. Two small, grimy figures huddled in an alleyway. A boy of about 12 and his younger sister. Their faces were pinched with hunger, their eyes old with a grief no child should ever know. They were Elias and Ruth, the children of the Miller family, who had owned the small ranch bordering their own. Chloe knew the Millers had been one of the first families to be forced out by the railroad. Their land snapped up for pennies on the dollar after a series of unfortunate accidents. The parents, broken and destitute, had succumbed to fever that winter. Chloe's heart ached. She saw in them the same desperation she had once felt. Without a word to Mark, she walked into the mercantile and came out with a warm loaf of bread and a block of cheese. She gave it to the children, who devoured it with a silent, ferocious hunger. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of those two orphans was seared into her mind. "Mark," she said into the darkness of their room, "we have so much. This house, this land. It feels selfish to keep it to ourselves when there is so much suffering." Mark knew what she was asking. He had seen the children too. He had felt the same pull on his conscience. "The good book says to care for the widow and the orphan," he said softly, his arm tightening around her. "It is our duty. It is our blessing." The next day they went back to town. They found Elias and Ruth and made them an offer, not of charity but of a home. The children, wary and accustomed to cruelty, were hesitant, but they saw the kindness in Mark's eyes and the gentle strength in Chloe's, And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to hope. Life on the ranch transformed the children. Good food filled out their thin frames. Hard work brought purpose back to their eyes. Elias, who had been sullen and angry, discovered a gift for working with animals under Mark's patient guidance. Ruth, who had been as silent as a shadow, began to sing as she helped Chloe in the garden, her small voice mingling with Chloe's richer tones. The ranch house, once so quiet, was now filled with the sounds of a family. One rainy afternoon, Chloe was helping the children sort through the few meager possessions they had brought with them. Among the worn-out clothes and pathetic toys was a heavy, leather-bound book. It was their father's old account ledger. "He was always writing in this," Elias said, his voice quiet. Chloe opened the book. Most of the pages were filled with figures and notes about cattle sales and feed costs, but tucked into a flap in the back cover was a folded oilskin-wrapped packet. Curious, she carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a deed. It was a map. It was old, hand-drawn on brittle parchment, the ink faded. But it was incredibly detailed. It showed the entire valley, every creek, every spring, every rise and fall of the land. At the bottom was a signature, Captain John C. Fremont, U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, 1845. It was an original Federal Survey map, a historical document of immense importance. But it was more than that. As Chloe traced the faded lines with her finger, her breath caught in her throat. The map clearly showed the boundaries of the original land grants in the valley. And according to this official, undeniable survey, the railroad's claims were almost all fraudulent. They had systematically altered boundaries, moved survey markers, and claimed land that was never theirs to begin with. The map in her hands wasn't just a map. It was a weapon. It was the proof that could save not just their ranch, but every ranch in the valley. The children's father must have found it, realized its significance and hidden it away. And it had probably cost him his life. Mark came in from the barn, shaking the rain from his hat. He saw the map spread out on the table, saw the look on Chloe's face, and understood immediately. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Their personal struggle had just become something much, much bigger. God hadn't just brought them together to save themselves. He had brought them together and brought these children to them to save everyone. The locked door on their wedding night felt like a lifetime ago. It had been a barrier of fear, but now all the doors were open, and through them was about to pour a flood of justice that would wash the valley clean. Thank you for being part of this story. These tales of quiet courage and unexpected grace remind us that even in the darkest of times, a single act of faith can change the world. If you believe in the power of stories to connect us and inspire us, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We have a new story waiting for you tomorrow, and I promise you won't want to miss it.